if we give people shitty hardware to work with, we kind of can't blame them when it all goes wrong. But sadly for Dyatlov, this disaster in Chernobyl, it was really a management and a scientific disaster rather than some kind of true interface failure. But the less severe but very real catastrophe at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania in 1979, this was very much caused by this failure in interface design. So in short, there was this valve that got stuck open and it allowed this reactor coolant to escape from this nuclear power plant. And at a microscopic level, the problem was that there was this indicator on the panel and it lit up when the valve was in working order, which is pretty useless. Like what you want it to do is to light up whether the valve is open or closed. But I want to focus on a much bigger topic, which is this training simulator. This is the training simulator for this actual control panel. And it's wild. Like there are 1,100 dials here. There are 600 different alarms. I think the report into the failure said there were 14 different meanings for red lights on this control panel, 11 different meanings for green lights. And the mental model that these operators must have had was kind of mind-blowing. And then you add on top the fact that there are actually 2 adjacent reactor control rooms, and they were built as mirror images of each other for some reason. So staff would work these kind of alternate shifts in completely mirrored interfaces one day to the next. And I've always thought, because of my fascination with this, how awesome would it be to kind of have one of these in my room that I can tinker with and poke the buttons and make it do things. And it's not very practical, of course, but as Fiona alluded to, I discovered kind of a much better way to indulge this interface love, but in miniature form. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the website Bricklink before. I really suggest that you do not visit it until after this talk, because just imagine a website where you can select like one by one every possible Lego brick that you'd like to purchase, including, of course, all of these interface panels. And one day last summer, that's exactly what I did. In fact, if you can see my camera, I kind of have them all here still. And you might remember these were the sought after bricks of your childhood. These are the ones that you always fought over your siblings with for the builds. And I think what's really awesome about these bricks is that they all demonstrate this infinitely wide variety of interface concepts on this same little canvas. So we have fantasy bricks and abstract designs and historical ones and futuristic concepts. And some of them are super specialized and some are just completely generic. And you have this humble little 2x2 brick with this 45-degree slope. And it's this whole wonderful lesson in interface design. Now, most of these bricks, they blend 2 main ingredients. They blend screens and buttons. And to explore this interplay between the physical and the digital, it's good to look back to 2007 when Steve Jobs got up on stage and announced the launch of the iPhone. And as we all know, sure, like the iPhone was the first time we'd ever really come to understand and try out and use a touch screen. But for a device that started such a revolution in touch interface, what I think is very particularly fascinating are the features that Apple still chose to implement in a physical button. So there are 4. There's the power button, the mute button, the volume control, and the home button. And these 4, they're great because they cover these 4 core use cases for bringing kind of complementary physical inputs alongside some kind of screen. So first up, we have these technical requirements. I think most consumer hardware still needs some kind of physical power button or some way to reset it. There's not much hardware out there without any button at all. You'll come across kind of regulatory requirements that need hardware kill switches and things like this. And then we have this mode control. And the mute button is this hotkey or shortcut, basically, to this predefined function. It's like a hotkey in a car or on a radio. And what's cool is obviously we have the ability to actually feel the current state and not just read it. So you can think of all the times in a wedding or cinema that you've like thumb that button in your pocket to check it's on silent. And then the third is blind operation. So what's really interesting to me about these volume buttons, like turning up and down the volume mid-call, is that these buttons are built to be used when you're not looking at them, which is something you can't say for pretty much any touchscreen ever. And this whole concept of blind operation applies to all kinds of physical inputs in gaming and heads-up displays and car dashboards and things like this. And then finally, there's this topic of orientation. And screens can change, graphics move around, and pixels shift, and navigation can be kind of quite stressful if you're not very familiar with it. But I think the single greatest UX concept on this iPhone was this physical one, this home button, and this like accessibility that no matter where you were and how lost you were, you could kind of come back to it with the same repeatable tap, which is a shame because if we jump forward 13 years, it's the only button that's never made it, of course. Like, it's kind of remarkable that for all these leaps in display technology and camera quality and processor speed, since 2007, the hardware buttons have just stayed the same. And well, they were identical until 2017, when the home button was kind of lost. And yeah, I'd argue it's definitely made it harder for these novice users to orientate on. And this balance between physical and digital inputs is fascinating to me because there's not really any guidance on kind of what features we should implement in hardware and which in software, and we get it wrong all the time. So these are the helm controls of a US Navy destroyer. And the reason I chose this particular choice of analog versus screen split is that in 2017, this interface was responsible for the collision with the USS John McCain off the coast of Singapore, and it killed 10 people, and it put this massive hole in the side of the boat. And so to the extent that 1 year ago, the Navy announced that they're going to begin reverting all these destroyers back to this physical control system, because the sailors said that they overwhelmingly prefer these mechanical controls to the touchscreens that were installed. So back to the Lego, kind of what exactly can these little colorful bricks teach us about avoiding mistakes in interface design? And first, I think this variety of design can be quite overwhelming. So it's important to classify them a bit. And naturally, I did this in Lego as well. So horizontally, we have some kind of approximation for how much screen we see. Vertically, some kind of measure of the structure or chaos that's apparent in this. And you get these few clusters. There's this middle left region here with this whole host of like screen dominated displays with a little row of buttons. The far top right has these really precise organized layouts. The center bottom is this wild west of wacky and alternative concepts that are pretty hard to understand. And when you design one of these machine interfaces, it's this juggling act of all these different factors, but you can break it down into two key questions. And the first question is, how can we differentiate between the function of these different inputs? And secondly, how can we organize these inputs and outputs so that we understand how they relate to each other? Now, back in 2015, Ford brought out this Lincoln MKC, and it's just the most wonderful example of the importance of input differentiation. So this car doesn't have traditional gear shifting. You can see they have this row of buttons on the left-hand side, drive and neutral and sport. And then also there's this start-stop button down here, which is pretty convenient next to the driver. And I think maybe you can see the impending disaster here, like these drivers on the motorway, they're reaching for the sport button and they hit the identically shaped button next to it and they pretty much kill the engine. And obviously this is very bad. And in the end, Ford recalled, I think, 13,500 of these cars just to make a really subtle design shift that you can see here and just lifting it up to the top like this. So let's compare these interfaces. When you talk about differentiation, we don't care about the overall layout. We just focus on the individual switches. So imagine you're operating a plane or a boat, and you're kind of trying to feel blindly for one of these buttons with your little clumsy Lego hands. Quite clearly, this left panel would require a lot more careful hand-eye coordination, whereas the unit on the right has this really kind of large throttle with this big linear movement, these smaller toggle switches, these push buttons. And we call these different codings. And there are 6 primary codings that we can make use of in design. And the first in the top left here is size coding. And you see this a lot in interfaces with a primary and secondary action. Think about these big emergency buttons that we get on the train stations. It's much easier to find and hit than the secondary, the big emergency button than the secondary information button underneath it. And the second of these 6 is shape coding. And shape coding in some way was the original coding that introduced the world to this whole problem in the first place. If you go back to World War II, we had large numbers of fighters like these B-17 and B-25 bombers, and they were crash landing on their return from operations. And there was no mechanical fault with the planes. It was just human error that caused the planes to crash. But the human causing the error wasn't the pilot, but the designers in this case. And there was a young man, Alphonsus Chapanis, who worked it all out. And he was basically tasked to investigate this problem. And the result of his research was pretty much the birth of human factors and ergonomics as we know it now. And what he realized was that the landing gear and the flap control levers were identically shaped. So you had these highly stressed pilots coming back from a mission, and they'd reach down to operate the landing gear lever, and they just hit the flaps lever by mistake and caused the plane to hit the ground. And his fix during the war was really simple. So he glued these different shaped strips of rubber onto the levers to differentiate them. And this shape coding was so successful that after the war, this design was standardized. And here it is. It still exists in the federal aviation regulations today. Now, like size and shape coding, color coding is pretty obvious in hindsight, but for some reason, it's the only one that's actually made it into our everyday language. And I think consequently, it's obviously the most commonly used differentiator in all kinds of physical and digital interface design. I could have picked any picture. The start ride button in this original Waymo self-driving car, I think highlights it very nicely. And then our fingers have more touch receptors per unit area than probably almost anywhere else on the body. And texture coding is this really nice way to differentiate between similar dials and levers that have related but different functions. Basically, it works by applying this different surface texture onto these adjacent touch points. So think about these microscopes where you've got a fine and a coarse rotary dial, and you can put a finer and a coarser texture to reinforce the action of these two different movements. Products with a strong ergonomic fit, like binoculars or gaming consoles, they can exploit this position coding. So if you imagine the natural resting position of your hand on the product, now some of these inputs will lie directly under your fingers, and others are going to require a specific movement away from this default position. And this spatial distribution, this difference between your normal and abnormal positions, this is position coding at work. And finally, there's operation coding. And this is all about giving these different types of movement, like a twist or a vertical slide, to different inputs. So your hand is really forced to twist and push and slide in a different manner for each action. And you can imagine, obviously, raising a crane lever by pulling on the crane lever at the same time, and you match this sort of action to the type of effect that comes out of it. And these are these 6 core codings: so size, shape, color, texture, position, and operation. And you can build all kinds of really clear, precise switches with these codings. But if you want to help people really understand how they relate to each other, you have to organize it all. So take this business class airline seat. Maybe some of you remember we used to fly to different countries and we could see these things occasionally. And sure, some differentiation between these inputs would help a bit, but really it's the whole organization of this interface that's missing. Like this whole thing's a mess. We have these global shortcuts in the middle here for the whole seat, some kind of individual settings for multiple axes of movement. And in the middle, we have something else. I have no idea what it does, but it's pretty wild, this whole thing. And you might be thinking, yeah, George, I know, like, it's obvious. We solve this problem all the time in UI design. And to which I'm going to say, well, okay, why don't you show me? So I teach a master's course in physical interface design at the university here in Salzburg. And we use this image as a starting point for an exercise. And Fiona and I thought it would be fun to try with you now. So Fiona's about to, I think, forcibly eject you all into small breakout rooms with 3 or 4 other people. We're going to give you 5 minutes. Grab a piece of paper or anything to hand, or just have a chat with the people that you're there with. And I would like you to redesign this interface for me right now in any way you like, with any technology that you choose to. And I'll see you back here in 5 minutes or so.
Great, thank you. I'm just doing the rooms now. Hopefully that's working.
Are we all back, Fiona?
I think so, yes.
Great. That was I didn't realize that I get to do it as well. I didn't so I'm glad that I got put somewhere else. I think it's a shame there's no chat where we can share pictures or something. I'd quite like to see anything that got discussed or anyone came up with. Like, I'd be particularly curious how many of you sort of redesigned the button layout or went for a touch screen, or how many of you considered kind of accessibility, or maybe people with limited mobility or vision in it, or whether anyone did anything really wild, like some kind of gesture control where you can sit here and move the seat up and down, or maybe having like a little model of a seat, like a Play-Doh seat, and you can kind of bend it into different shapes. But when we look at interfaces like this, and particularly if I think back to things like those reactor control rooms from before, when I try and create an analogy with digital interface design, with UI, it's a bit like building a single UI layout for your entire app that can never change, where you have to get every possible feature onto the screen at one time. And that's basically how the interface is, and it's fixed. I think some of you might recognize this as the old Microsoft Word from 2003. As an aside, in 2007, they brought out this version with the ribbon that I think we all know. And I think one of the main reasons for introducing this ribbon was because they realized that pretty much the most requested features in Word already existed, but nobody could find it in the mess of menus and toolbars that were there at the time. But to go back to the Lego, I think at a basic level, we can use these principles of visual perception and psychology, to cluster these groups of switches. It's pretty obvious that the colored panels on the blue brick, they had a lot of clarity to distinguish these different groupings. But this question of organization is not so much a question of how to distinguish these groupings, but what groupings we should form in the first place. Like, why does it make sense to have certain interface components together, and why separate others? And maybe you thought about this as well when you were looking at the airline seat. So if we return to this mess of power plant control panels, and here's some of my favorite examples. There's some real kind of Soviet classics here. The top left is the US nuclear ship Savannah. And you have these crazy walls of nonsensical dials and levers, and they're all brought to life in this giant schematic. It's the most literal representation and organization of the information you can have, like a giant interactive org chart of the machine. And in Lego, we find this approach taken mostly with their fantasy-orientated designs. And this is for good reason, because these schematics are superb when you need to get a mental model of the inner workings of some alien system. Like, I have no idea what these inputs do on this Lego bricks, but I'm pretty sure that I could work out what buttons were connected to other buttons in the spaceship that I was in charge of operating. And these Soviet control panels are also really great examples of consolidated interfaces, where in effect, every switch and dial from all around the factory has been grouped and displayed in one giant wall. And there's a really good automotive equivalent of this consolidated approach that we find in the cancelled electric car project from Dyson. And in this car, they chose not to introduce this standard center console of buttons between the front two seats, but the aim was to put as much functionality as possible into one place, into the steering wheel. Hence, you see the button for the parking handbrake and the wipers and the mic, mute, and the lowering and raising of the suspension, all next to each other. But if you imagine for a moment the opposite approach of this, so the opposite approach of the Soviet control rooms, imagine taking every dial and lever and physically moving it next to the actual valve that it's operating, no matter where it is in the factory. And in a factory, that doesn't really make any sense. But I love this counterexample from the Audi TT and their air vents. And you'll all know the situation in a car where you reach down to set the airflow speed or temperature, then you put your hand up into the airflow and check it's working, and then you go back down and adjust it and put your hand back. And these beautiful interfaces solve this exact problem by putting the function and the interface and the feedback all in the same location with these small displays and dials in the center. And I call this a distributed interface, because each piece of this interface is spread around to the location where it's adjacent to the thing that it's actually operating or interfacing with. And whether you have this distributed or consolidated approach, what's important is that the interface organization matches the use case. So if you think back to the Soviet control rooms and those interface panels, they were really good at answering a question like, does this valve let water into tank B? But the problem is that they're very poor at answering different sorts of questions, such as, are all the water valves closed? Or where are all the switches I need to prepare for the shift changeover? And these differing use cases give rise to some alternative organizational philosophies that we can also take a look at through the Lego. And the first one here is feature-based organization. And I'd argue this is so common that it's pretty much the default design philosophy. If you're not consciously trying to organize your interface, you'll just do this anyway. And you group all the related inputs and outputs for each product feature together. So we have these two clear clusters, perhaps one for temperature control, another for vital signs monitoring. And in the real world, I love this COVID-19 ventilator from Cambridge Consultants in Cambridge, of course. And it's this wonderful example with these really clearly labeled panels for ventilation control or respiratory settings. And you also see this feature-based approach a lot in cars, of course. You have a cluster of switches for airflow. You have all the buttons for the lights on one big control stick. Now, organization by operation means putting all your interface elements that function in a similar manner together. I have no idea what all these switches here do, but they were probably placed together to make a nice looking row on the panel and not for any practical benefit. An example from Israel here, these set of water meters that are entering this building, like the levers have been arranged here for the convenience of the installation. But from the end user perspective, the homeowner perspective, this isn't relevant at all. They only care about the one lever that connects them to the water going into their own home. The third one here, this charming little brick, I think is one of my favorites from this whole set. And I really like to imagine that this is an early 1990s police control unit, and the designers, that they're forced to divide the audio and video playback into these separate areas. Maybe they had this newer tape reel technology that was incompatible with the older analog phone line system. And this is organization by technology, where we're forced to separate the interface for technical, not UX reasons. So today, most of our interfaces are fly-by-wire. It's just switches and circuit boards behind the panel. But historically, of course, when you sat in that tractor and pulled that lever, that was directly pulling the hydraulic or mechanical system that it operated. And that puts big constraints on your interface because you cannot just put your levers anywhere you like because the systems underneath constrain it. And there's a very modern equivalent, which we've already covered loads of times today, because in effect, any touch screen with buttons by the side has this technology-based split. Like Bob and Doug here on their maiden SpaceX voyage, ideally they put these physical inputs embedded directly in the touch screen next to the information it relates to. But as it happens, they just kind of sit here awkwardly along the side, and we accept it as if that's perfectly normal. And all of these approaches so far, this organization by feature, by operation, by technology, they've all been grounded in properties of the system and not the user. So if you imagine arriving for work each day at the Lego body scanner factory, and you'd probably have some switches that said things like radiation control or scanner inputs. But you could also group the switches by task, like prepare the machine, load the body, process the scan, and you get a more complex organization behind the scenes, but this much more streamlined use case-based organization up front. And actually, I find it pretty rare to find a good implementation of use case-based organization in hardware interfaces. I think in the digital world, we get things like the shortcut apps on iOS, routines in home automation systems. These are really good examples. But I'm still on the lookout for some really nice physical examples that are built around user routines, not around some architecture of the technical system itself. Now, to finish, I'd like to quickly come back to this switch from the color coding example. And I sort of glossed over it quickly as a nice example of using color to differentiate button choice. But there's also something here that they consciously chose not to do, and they chose not to color the help button in red. And you can compare it to the 2015 Volkswagen, where the information button designed to blend in, but the SOS button stands out. And I think for as much as we've talked about these technical and practical ways to differentiate and organize physical inputs, we've pretty much avoided the entire topic of emotion in this. Both of these design decisions here help to differentiate the buttons, but the emotion of emphasizing or de-emphasizing the safety aspect of the vehicle can have a big impact on how you read the interface. Here's another great example, these two switches from Google smart home speakers. They're both clear, both easy to identify. The Google Home Mini has this sliding switch. The Google Home has this push button. Maybe they even have identical electronics behind them, but I know which one I would rather push to disconnect the microphone on the product. And this emotion behind the physical interaction is the most important and powerful part of the whole experience for me. Think about in a car, most cars these days have a push button somewhere in the center near the steering wheel to start the engine. In a Lamborghini, they have a button hidden beneath a red flip cover, just like a switch for a weapon or some sort of missile in a fighter jet. And at the end of the day, the same thing happens. The car starts. But this action of flipping this cover open and plunging your finger into this recess beneath, like this is the emotion behind that physical interaction that you can never recreate on a screen. So as a quick recap of the things we looked at today, firstly, there's this balance between screens and buttons. There's no clear guidance. It's kind of down to you how you negotiate this hardware split. I think besides the technical requirements, physical interfaces, they really excel in this mode control and the blind operation and for quick orientation. Then there's two key problems to solve. Firstly, this differentiation, where we can use these 6 codings, the shape, size, color, texture, position, and operation to really separate these different inputs. And then we have to organize the interface. And there are 2 opposite approaches, this distributed and this consolidated approach we saw in the Dyson and the Audi cars. These schematic-based approaches that work really well, these kind of wild alien concepts. But for most situations, you can do some kind of blend of feature, operation, technology, and use case-based organization. And then finally, never forget the emotion involved in that physical connection. Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, what I really want to do today is stroke my fingers across a pane of glass. Like if you can really match the physical interaction to the human emotion behind them, you're onto like a good start here. And if you've enjoyed this talk and you're curious kind of how I can make a living out of this blend of design and engineering interaction, then please have a look at this, my business here, interactionmagic.com. You can also hunt me down on Twitter or LinkedIn or Instagram. I'm pretty easy to find. So thanks very much for listening. Would love to have a little chat with you if there's any questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, George. That was excellent. It's a shame we can't get the feedback or the round of applause. It's a bit, silent with the virtual events. So I don't know, can you see the chat, George?
Yes.
So there's a pile of thanks coming in, and somebody commented there, Jeremy Smith commented, I think there was another detail in Chernobyl and one of the interface lights went on when a particular button was pressed, but it wasn't confirming that the action had completed successfully, just that the button had been pressed.
Yes, I think so as well. Yeah. Maybe this even was the story that I was trying to allude to, but maybe I said it quite incorrectly. But yeah, exactly that. It's like that challenge on an app where, like, do you show the toggle for the state that's going to happen when you push it, or do you show it for the state that it currently is before you push it, or something like this? Yes.
I was reflecting on some of the very complex interfaces, like the Russian control rooms, and I'm thinking about railway control signal control rooms and signal cabins and stuff. And what you do, the challenge of transitioning into a different organization when you've got workers who've been accustomed to a certain layout, illogical as it is, and then moving to more modern systems, and how you manage the transition really from, and it's a sort of delicate balance of managing the risk associated with transitioning across. Do
you mean like when you're upgrading this hardware, or you're introducing this new concept for it?
That's right. You're trying to move forward, but actually you might be sort of putting people at a disadvantage, certainly for the interim and the training period.
Yeah, but also there's also sometimes you just can't move forward fast enough. So when I remember designing, doing the HMI design on like CNC machines or something like this, and one of the things that we'd often use as a kind of way in with the client is to say that all these guys in your factory, or all these women operating these machines, like they've also got a Samsung phone, they've got an iPhone in their pocket or something, like they're not separating their interfaces in their private life from their personal life. And actually I sometimes find it's the opposite. People have such expectations from this hardware that they use in their personal lives, that when you can't deliver that same experience for some technical reason, for some safety reason, regulatory thing, in these like the railway cabin or something, then I actually find sometimes you fall short of what they want, rather than the fact that you go too fast and they can't keep up.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And here's a comment from Stephen Johnson. Old cars had lights that would come on only when there was a problem, being completely invisible before, out of window cleaning fluid, for example. On screen UI, we don't even need to reserve a space for it. How would you pick between showing its state all the time, keeping a spot for it to show when negative, or shifting the whole UI to accommodate it when it becomes a problem?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question the last 3 years I was working at a design agency called Kiska in Salzburg here, and Kiska we do an awful lot of, or when I was there we did an awful lot of automotive and two-wheel design. So we did all the dashboard interfaces on motorcycles, and here we only had maybe a 5-inch display or something, and we would lose the top 15% of this slice just because we had the telltales. You call them the handbrake or the warning light or the oil light. We had to reserve this space for them. And in the end of the day, you have a regulatory requirement that icon will never move its location. And you spend all your time trying to like sympathetically integrate this region that you've allocated and reserved for it. And I forget the homologation requirement exactly, but I think maybe you can't even overlap that space normally. It has to be left blank. You don't even have the option that you can just compress the other bits of the interface at the time. So I don't have a really clever answer to the question, but I really sympathize with exactly this point, because I had 2 colleagues, the main screen designers for this, who had a nightmare with this every day of their lives.
Thank you. And there's another question here from Simon Krusk. If people best react to physical and visual clues, color, position, how do future ideas such as haptic-based controls, where you can't see or touch it, or voice controls fit into best practices?
I'm curious if Simon's there. Is that, do you believe that people react best to these color and position, these physical cues, or are you saying it because you felt like it was what I was suggesting from the talk?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think ultimately, people do things physically in the real world. They move around and so forth. Humans are doing type animals a lot more than they tend to be, virtually in their heads type beasts is the way I describe it. Mm-hmm. And I'm just aware that voice controls, I find them hard to be comfortable with, and I find things like the new ideas coming on like haptics. I can't even touch the thing, so if it's not getting my gestures correct, I can't even understand what I'm doing wrong. In simple terms, there's a great tendency with technology to move forward. It just may not be reality effective with how humans operate. That's my sort of, I suppose, expressing it now in words. That's where I was coming from.
Yes. And I think you have to ask whether these new, it's just my opinion, but you have to ask whether these new modalities of interaction, this voice control, is there a new use case and a new need that it's serving, or is it just replicating what we had before with a different way? Like, people have these Alexas and Google Homes in their house, and probably 90% of the time you use it to start or stop the music you're listening to, or set an alarm for the cooking or something like this. And so there are these 1 or 2 remote or hands-free operations that you want, and then the rest of the time asking a question or interrogating or looking something up is no quicker than the way that you already know. I think it's just how I feel. I think it's when you talk about the haptics and things like this, I think often what is just really key is that you augment the modality or the interface that you have with this additional element. So you add this vibration or this haptic feedback, this additional bit, and they complement each other in a nice way. You don't cut out everything that you already know and create some kind of minority report thing because it looks good, and all people want to do is just push these hotkeys or something like this.
Great, thank you. We've got another question from Cristiano. How much of the UX design process at Lego is based on cognitive development for kids? Guessing they represent a good portion of the users.
I mean, this is a great question for Lego. I can't claim to have any insight into to how they do it. They certainly I'm very envious of the design teams there and the thinking that goes into it. And also they have some very interesting explorations, I think, in recent years into new kind of augmented or digital physical crossover products. But yeah, maybe you know more than me, or if anyone on this call knows. But yeah, I'm just a fan rather than anyone with any particular insights.
Okay, thank you. And I think we'll maybe one more question from David. Although we learn different processes, a button used to be turned clockwise to turn volume up on a radio, yet we're okay with vertical up down now.
It wasn't so much a question, it was more
Yeah.
input into Simon's conversation of, like, we go in small steps, right? So the old analog turny volume up on a radio, we're quite happy with an up down on a remote now, right, without any problem. So, you know, haptic is new, and I'm sure that there's some instances that we're happy with, but you just don't go all or nothing, right? Which is what you were saying, I think, George, is that you make small iterative changes, right?
Yeah, but it's interesting you mentioned the up down. To come back to these the motorcycles and the two-wheel vehicle interfaces, another big problem that we always had, as well as the homologation with the icons, is if we had an interface that, say, had a up down enter and back, or left right enter and back, and then you have to put a music player on it, and you've only got one axis of arrows. So do you say that you have skip and forwards and skip, left and right, but then you have to put volume up and volume down horizontal? Or do you have volume up and down, but then you have to work out whether is skip the track up or skip the track backwards down? And yeah, we were, or do you try and skew it diagonally somehow and go, it's a bit up and back and left and down? Yeah, this is just another one of these things that was always an interesting challenge for us. I
guess that's where the user testing comes in.
Yes, but I'd say some of the pain of it is that it can be half user testing and half whatever your supplier decides is capable of being manufactured, or some other constraint like this. But, yes, definitely.
Okay, and then Sarah comments that interesting that Apple Watch has a turning dial for volume, so not consistent but familiar.
Yes.
Okay, so I think the questions have come to an end there. Lots of thank yous and great talk, and I think everybody's shares our gratitude. That was excellent, George. Really interesting insights, and really appreciate you joining us, especially in the midst of your move and massive logistics operation, I think. So thanks. That's really, really interesting. And I remembered to hit record about 30 seconds in to your talk, so we'll be able to share a link to the recording on the UX page, and with your PowerPoint facility of the subtitles as well.
Yeah, I'm actually, I was saying, apologies, someone asked how they turn off the transcription because it grabs the focus away. Yeah, we wanted to, I think it's done through PowerPoint, so it's not controlled through Zoom, but we wanted to try it to help people who can't follow my English or something like this. Yeah, I appreciate it's not so good for everybody, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I think it worked well. Thank you. So, yeah, so we'll wrap up there then. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you again to our sponsors, Haybrook IT, Oxford Computer Consultants, and Fruto. And yeah, thanks all. We look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks, hopefully, if you can join us just after Easter. Have a good break.
Thank you.
Best of luck, George. Best of luck with the move.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye.
Bye now.